Hi, thanks for coming. Thanks for being here today. Thanks for coming to my talk. This session's called Three Little Words. I'm going to show you some techniques to show your users that you care about them as much as they care about you, and demonstrate a couple techniques for how you can develop your apps for inclusivity and global reach as well. Oh man. One sec. All right, there we go. So as developers and designers, we all put a lot of work into what we build, into our apps. And if we're lucky, those apps also capture the hearts and minds of our users, and they'll start investing their time back into what we create for them. In fact, the average time the users spend on their phones is going up. It's over 2 hours a day, steadily increasing every year due to smartphones, the stickiness of the apps that are on there, and the utilities that these devices and applications bring these people in their lives. And from Android perspective, it's about half the devices in North America and more than half in other parts of the world. So it's a significant part of the audience that we're talking about here today. And when you ship apps that improve their lives, it has a big improvement and a big impact across the world. So I'm going to show you these techniques about how you can show people that you care, and when you apply these, take advantage of what Android operating system, Android Studio, and the Play Store gives to you, you'll be able to reach more users with the apps you're already building. So just take a step back. So my name is Rowan Kerr. I work here as P13T, but maybe better known as Publicis Sapient. It's just kind of long, so I like to sort of shorten it a bit. It can be a lot to say and even more to type, so a little bit of a short form there. What does Sapient do? We're focusing on digital business transformation, so we help established companies increase customer value, drive operational effectiveness, and thrive in an evolving world. Part of this is helping them stay ahead of the disruption that's coming from the technology side of things, Silicon Valley, other startups, things like that. That's kind of how we're positioning ourselves. And as our clients work across the worldwide scale, the apps they create operate in multiple countries. They also generate revenue back to the business. They're not just marketing expenses anymore. These are real lines of business, new forms of revenue for our clients. So it's really important to help users feel comfortable using these apps and show that they're appreciated by the business just as much as the users are appreciating and getting value out of these applications. So when you hear the phrase three little words, maybe something comes to mind. You might be thinking of a song from the 30s, maybe some early jazz, or maybe a musical from the 50s, if you're familiar with that sort of era of movie making. But what are they really? So the first word starts with an I, the second with an L, the third is a Y. So you might have an idea of what it is. If you put them all together, of course, you get I18N, L10N, and A11Y. That's right, what you were thinking, right? So I18N, L10N, A11Y. What those stand for, in the same way that I shortened the name of my company previously, these are the short forms for internationalization, localization, and accessibility. On that topic of accessibility, we created the Accessible e-commerce store. Earlier this year, we released it for Global Accessibility Awareness Day. It's a bit of a prototype to demonstrate how somebody can build a web-based experience that is completely accessible for all the functionality, browsing products, configuring them, searching, adding things to your cart, and checking out. That's the overall vision for that product. And I'm going to be using a bit of a starter Android version to illustrate some concepts today. So first off, we'll get into internationalization. So you're here, we're in Canada. Sometimes we think it looks like this, or we'd like to think so. Doesn't always though, most of the time it's more like this. There's not all that many people here day to day, right? So we're 37 million here. You look to the south, there's 10 times that many people. Keep going out, include India and China, we start shrinking even smaller. And then the entire planet, we're just that thin red line right at the top there. So most of your users for your apps aren't actually here. Even though Android is greater than 50% market share in most countries, your users aren't just in Canada. So you can't just launch something here and have a complete business. I mean, you might be able to, but at some point you'll want to scale and reach out beyond just this local country. So if your users aren't where you are and they don't speak your language, and they maybe don't have the same customs as you, then how do you make sure you have, building a good experience for them, that they can have a good experience with your products? So in terms of internationalization, you can think about it as steps that you create to prepare your app for localization, which is kind of the second step here. So this can involve everything from business requirements, design changes, infrastructure updates on the back end. It's not just app development. This is a more holistic preparation phase that you can go through to kind of get everything ready for the next step. Now, in this phase, you have to deal with things like country-specific regulations, data residency, Play Store publishing, and maybe you want to use the translation service as well from Play Store. So in terms of country regulations, you've got two main ones that are starting to kick in. You have GDPR in the EU, which came into effect last year. That has a big impact on what data you store, what you can track about users, what country it lives in, whether you can share it or not with your business partners. So you have to think about that if you're going to launch something in the EU. Also, California has recently passed something that's similar but not exactly the same. That's coming into effect at the beginning of next year. So those are two big things to be aware of. If you're not currently dealing with them and you want to expand, you have to work through those business problems or not so much problems, but challenges definitely in dealing with those regulations. In terms of data residency, so this is where the data that your app collects or generates actually lives physically on a server somewhere in some country. So you may have to re-architect your services. If you're cloud-based, for example, everything's running in the US or maybe in Canada, you might have to change that up if you're going to a new country. So Germany often has regulations that any data you collect about their users or content that they generate, it has to stay within the EU because of their regulations. So you can't necessarily send it back to the US. In terms of how the Play Store helps you with this, so if you've ever published an app, you'll have seen this selection. A lot of times people will just check all the boxes and not really think about it. You can select every country and new countries that get onboarded, but probably what you want to do is start with a few countries that you know you can support well, and then expand from there once you go beyond those things and start to add new languages or find customers in new markets. You can go through that. So it sort of looks like this. You have your country selector, and then you can go and manage and say if you want to make it available or not. You can even select what cell phone operators your app will work on within those specific countries. So there's quite a lot of granularity available there. If you have some business reason for leaving one operator off and working on another one, you can definitely do that. But I'd say take a bit of a cautious approach with this. You probably don't want to check all right off the bat. You may get some unexpected results coming through down the line. In terms of translation services, so this isn't necessarily for your app content, but this is for your Play Store listings. So maybe you want to go into another country, you're not ready to localize your actual application, but people probably know English well enough. Maybe it's something simple that they can immediately start using. If you don't have somebody to work with to translate your Play Store listing, Google has a service that you can pay for, and they will translate it for you. So you have real people going through this. It's just right inside the Play Store. This will include your app listing, all your details about your app and everything, and they can get it done. They say in a couple days if it's a simple ask or you only have a couple languages that you want to translate to. So that's a nice thing that you can do without any coding, no technical skills needed for that side of things, and then you can get your listing at least cleaned up and ready to go in new markets. So now you're sort of prepared. You've thought through all the business scenarios and impacts about going beyond just Canada or US or whatever your initial country was. and you're ready to kind of start then get into working on your actual application. So it's time to move on to localization. So localization is not so much getting ready, this is actually doing the work. This is making your app feel comfortable for users who may be from different countries, speaking different languages, sometimes with drastically different methods of laying out text in case of right to left. There's different things that you have to account for there. Fortunately, Android has tools to help us with all of this. So the first bit is working with resources. So you'll have seen these in Android Studio. You have a list, you have values and images and drawables and things like that. So first thing you want to do is make sure all your strings are in resources. Take them out of your app. If you've hard-coded anything, you'll be getting warnings from Android Studio anyway because it's trying to enforce this best practice for you. But extract them all, put them in strings. That will set you up to be able to do the translation much easier. Then what you can do is go and add resources with the locale qualifier and then marks as well sections of strings that shouldn't be translated. So what does this look like? It's really simple. So Android Studio, you just say new, give me a resource file with values in it. In this case, we're selecting a English CA locale to add some specific translations for Canada, a resource that's just for this country. Since the default app language is usually American English, we're going to translate some stuff. So now it makes a new file. It bundles them up together so you don't have to go hunting through folders. They're all displayed right next to each other in Android Studio, and then you can change the strings that you need to change. So you can add what you want, override it from the default. One thing to watch out for is make sure your default locale has everything. Every string you're going to reference has to be in there. If not, your app will be forcibly closed by the operating system. If it can't find something, and if a user opens it in a language that doesn't have that default value and they're using a language you haven't translated to, the OS will actually shut you down. So besides resources, Android has this new-ish feature. It's been around for a year or so, the app bundle. This automatically splits your languages into different downloadable pieces of data that the Play Store will send down to your users based on their device. And then you can also query it. This year they've added the ability to query the languages that are available on the device as well as languages you can download. So if you want to move your language selection and customize it and not rely on the operating system to tell you what it is, you can implement this language picker yourself. So by default, the Play Store just gives you what it is. It checks the language on your device. It slices everything else out of the app bundle, downloads just the resources you need. If you change the language on your device later, it will automatically go and re-download the new language for you. They don't have to reinstall the application, again, just to get the new language. So this is good if you're going for regular behavior, you don't have any strange requirements about an in-app language picker, but if you do, then languages basically behave like dynamic features now. So if you use feature modules, you can query for what's installed, you can ask on demand for the Play Store to go and install the new feature for you. You can now do the same thing with languages. It's also done through the split install manager. So you set it up, you get a list of what's installed, then you ask for a new split install request to install the new piece of content, tell it what language you're looking for, and then ask for the install. The Play Store framework will automatically go and add that for you. In terms of string formatting, one thing to watch out for, not every string has components that should be translated. So if you have something in your string like this says, how many days until a sale in this e-commerce store is going to end, the days part is a number that gets formatted in a certain way. It's a time period, so we want that to stay together. So you can tag that with the xlif tag in your string resource and make sure that that won't be translated automatically. You can go ahead and translate the rest of the string just fine and position that in the correct spot for the correct language that you're translating into. A couple comments about right-to-left languages, because they're pretty well supported. A lot of stuff happens automatically, especially if you're using material components and the new Jetpack libraries. But Two things to watch out for. You can have a specific layout for right to left if you need it, and you can put different things in there. The second thing is that don't use left and right anymore in your views. You can use start and end instead, and that will make sure that when things flip around to go right to left, that everything works as expected. Also, if you're importing vector graphics, you can enable auto mirroring for these. So if you have an arrow for us, it would normally point to the right in an RTL language. That should actually go to the left. So Android Studio will do this for you automatically. So that covers localization. Then you get your strings, you get your assets, you get your layouts, everything that you need. You can customize and override things using some very simple built-in tools. So the last bit is just covering accessibility. We've got a lot of users out there that are already dealing with this. They have different disabilities. They need assistive technology to help them interact with these products and get the same level of service that we do, being fully sighted, for example, versus partially sighted or completely blind. It's a little different. So Canada's got 3 million, US has 35 million, and globally there's 1 billion people. And we expect these numbers to grow in different countries as the population ages as well. More people will need these technologies to help them. It's also heavily regulated. Canada has the AODA, which is the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. That's kind of getting adopted in other provinces as well, though it's not formally a national standard. And the US has ADA, which is an older law from the 90s, but they reinforced that recently with Section 503, which you may have heard about. And these are being enforced. So there's lawsuits all the time. What used to happen until recently is the company would sort of settle those lawsuits. They'd come to some agreement. They'd make the improvements and give the users the level of service they were expecting from an accessibility standpoint. But Domino's is now going to court for this. They tried to go to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court didn't hear their case, which isn't the same as making a real determination about this, but that means that the lawsuit itself is still going to go ahead. So be aware of this. You are leaving yourself open to legal risk if you don't make your app accessible. For mobile apps, everything's based on the WCAG guidelines. There's 3 main buckets for these in terms of, is something perceivable, is it operable, is it understandable? I'm going to skim through this a little bit. You can get into the details on the W3C site. We can talk about it more afterwards, but in terms of perceivable, you want to have text alternatives, you want captioning for media, those sort of things to help users get the same value out of it that a sighted user is going to get. Same for operable. On a web browser in front of a laptop, you're going to look to see if you can operate with the keyboard, but in Android, it's more, can you use the accessibility features like Talkback to make sure that you can navigate through everything correctly. And understandable is more about predictability. The UI doesn't go into some weird mode just because you did some sort of ambient gesture or something like that. You always need to keep the interface of your application in an understandable state. So what Android gives us in this is 2 main tools. There's Talkback. This is what people with limited vision will use to navigate the operating system. It will speak to you whatever's on the screen. So it's part of the accessibility tools. You go into your settings, you enable it. They'll take you through a tutorial so you can understand, because it doesn't work like a tap is not a regular tap anymore. It's a lot of double tapping and swiping and things like that to get around. So Google has this tutorial to help you get comfortable with the tool. And then there's the accessibility scanner. This will take a snapshot of what's on your screen and tell you if there are problems with it. So for example, there's duplicate description in this sample, but it will also call out things like low contrast colors, things that people with vision problems may have difficulty actually understanding and perceiving. And then if you have text views, those are handled automatically. If you have something that's important content, but it's not text, then you add the content description to it. That just goes directly into your view, make it a string resource so it can be translated as well, just like everything else, and then you're good to go. So just wrapping up here. Users really care about apps and products. You can see this from the sort of passionate reviews they leave. This is an example of an app that has about 1 million downloads or over 1 million downloads. You can see there's some very strong opinions expressed here. A lot of people are very positive about it, but a lot of people also have problems. So If you see this happening, this is actually a good sign in some ways, is that there's room for improvement and users care enough to leave this feedback for you to take some action on. So now, when you go back to take your apps back and look at them, evaluate them, see how they're working, and think about getting ready to maybe take the next step and go beyond the markets you're currently in, remember these 3 words: I18N, L10N, A11Y, internationalization, localization, and accessibility. And then maybe your users will say these words back to you. Thanks.